Hello everyone, in today's video I'm sharing this fun Z-fold Slimline card using the Pure Innocence stamp sets and few other products from my favorite things. And before we move forward, please go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and also hit that notification bell to get notified every time I upload a new video. Here is a quick look of how the card looks when it's taken out of the envelope. So let's dig right into it. I started with these two white panels. The base panel measures 8.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And the front panel or the folded panel measures 9 inches by 3.5 inches. And I'm scoring this panel at 4.25 and 8.5 inches. The measurements also appears in the bottom of the screen. Here I'm just reinforcing those score lines. And now I'm trimming off the edges just a little bit towards the 1/2 inch folded side. And this part will get glued to the back of the base panel. But before gluing them together, let's first create our background. I'm using the Slimline Drifts and Hills stencil from My Favorite Things and creating a hill all across the panel using Twisted Citron and Mode Lawn Distress Oxide inks. I'm using my blending brushes to ink up my background here, but you can use any kind of blending tool that you have in hand. I'm also using my water media mat from Waffle Flowers. It's a silicone mat that helps to keep the ink pad and cardstock in place without holding them. Next, I'm using Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide ink to ink up the sky. I'm not using any cloud stencil today to create my sky. Instead, I'm directly inking up the background panel using my blending brush, as I'm gonna use a Radiating Rays stencil from My Favorite Things to add sun rays to the scene, showing as if it's coming from behind the hills. And I wanted my scene to look continuous while my card was folded. So here, I have kept both my panels together as if they are glued together. And now I'm inking up the sun rays using Mustard Seed Distress Oxide ink. Since I'm using just the top half of the stencil to ink up my panel did not get inked up completely. So here I'm using some washi tape and lining it up with the already inked up rays and inking up the complete base panel. I was a little concerned that my yellow rays will turn green since I'm layering it on top of the blue sky that I inked earlier. But because I'm using Distress Oxide inks and their property to sit on top of each other helped me get this beautiful rays on my blue sky. Now that my right side of the panel was inked, I'm going to line up my stencil back again, making sure the rays line up properly, and start inking the other half of the base panel. Once done inking, I'll remove the stencil and repeat the same steps with the washi tape and ink up the whole left side of the base panel. It did take a few extra minutes to finish this background, but I think it added a very beautiful touch to the whole scene and added that nice bright color to the whole card. I repeated the same steps for my front panel, and this is how both the panels look. Now I'm going to add some texture to both these backgrounds by flicking some Stormy Sky Distress Oxide ink to the sky of both the backgrounds using a paintbrush. I'm using the stencil to mask off the hill. These stencils does not work like mask unlike lawn fawn stencils, but it did the job for me here. Once done, I'll let both these panels dry, and now I'm gluing them together using a combination of double-sided tape and liquid glue to make sure they're glued together properly. I like to use double-sided tape and liquid glue for strong hold, and liquid glue also gives you that little wiggle room that is really needed while gluing pieces like this. And here is how my card base looks. Once the card base is ready, now let's move on to coloring the images. This first image is the girl image from Pure Innocence Grow Together stamp set from My Favorite Things. I really like these images from Pure Innocence line of My Favorite Things, and I've been thinking of creating a card series using these stamp sets for a very long time. And this is my first video for that series. I will be bringing you 2 videos every month using the stamp sets from Pure Innocence line of My Favorite Things, along with few more stamp sets to help me create the scene. So here for the girl's image, I'm first coloring the skin. I'm using some E markers to color the skin. I used E15 as my darkest marker and added shadows. I blended those shadows using E13. I also added some color to her cheeks using R20 marker. Then I used E11 as my medium shade and blended the E13. Then used E00 to blend it further. Lastly, used E000 to blend everything out. Here I'm repeating the same steps again, starting with E15 marker, adding a second layer of color to the skin, blending that out using E13 marker. Then I'll come in with E11 and blend the E13, followed by E00, and then lastly use E000 to blend everything out. I like to add 2 layers of color to my images to get a better blend. Next, I'm coloring the water can that the girl is holding. I'm using cool gray markers here. I'm starting with my C5 marker and adding shadows. Next, I'm using C3 and blending C5. Then I'm using C2 and blending C3. And lastly, using C00 as my lightest marker and blending everything out. Here I'm adding another layer of color and repeating the same steps. I like to use cool gray markers for anything metal on my images, and I really liked how this water can turned out. Next, I'm using some YR markers to color the girl's boots. I'm using YR24 as my darkest marker and adding shadows. Then I used YR23 as my medium color and blended YR24 with it. And lastly, using YR21 as my lightest color and blending everything out. I'm using the same markers to color the girl's shirt. Again, adding shadows using YR24, blending that out using YR23, and lastly coming in with YR21 and blending everything out. Here I'm adding a second layer of color, going back with my darkest marker to the lightest marker. Next, for the skirt, I decided to use some B markers. I'm using B26 as my darkest marker, blending that out using B24, and lastly using B21 as my lightest marker and blending everything out. Here I first pulled out B23 instead of B21, but B23 looked little dark to me, so I decided to go with B21 instead. Again, adding a second layer of color. I tend to use 3 to 4 markers to color each part of my image, but sometimes it's really hard to get a good contrast with just 3 or 4 markers. For example, to color the skin for this girl image, I had to use 5 markers because I was not getting a very good contrast if I just used 3 or 4 markers. Here I'm adding some details to my image using my white gel pen and black gel pen. I quickly drew few flowers on the skirt using my white gel pen. Using my black gel pen, I made the eyes of the girl a little more darker and now adding some dot details to her shirt. This is a very good way to add texture to your images and also adding a lot more interest by just few here and there tweaks without changing a lot of things. I added dot details to her cheek and added highlights wherever needed on the image using my white gel pen. For my gnome here, I'm using some cool gray markers to color his beard. I wanted his beard to be white, but I'm adding some shadows using my cool gray markers. I used C5 as my darkest marker and added shadows wherever needed. I basically followed the image to add my shadows. It's pretty easy to do that. Next, I used C3 marker and blended that C5 and pulled that color a little more further inside. Then I used C2 as my medium color and blended that C3. Lastly, using C00 as my lightest marker and just blending everything out. Then I used my colorless blender to just move the color a little bit and remove any harsh lines. I was pretty much happy with the coloring here, but I had missed few areas that I am just coloring here right now. To color the nose and hands of the gnome, I'm using E11, E00 and E000 Copic markers. This gnome image is from the Spring Gnome Stamp set from My Favorite Things. This stamp set is one of my favorite from the spring release. It's just so beautiful with all these gnome images, and I love the collection of flowers that's been added in this stamp set. Next, to color the bunny ears on the gnome, I used R20 to color the inside of the ears. Next, used the same cool grays to add color to his ears. For the carrot in Gnome's hand, I used YR18 as my darkest color and used YR02 as my lightest color. For the images this small, it's better to not blend them a lot. So I like to use just two markers, the darkest and the lightest, and add shadows and then fill the whole area with the lightest color. This way you get that contrast in the image that you're looking for without blending the color too much. Next, for my gnome's hat, I'm using the same B markers that I used to color the girl's skirt, adding shadows using B26 marker, then blending that out using B24, and lastly coming in with B21 as my lightest color and blending everything out, adding a second layer of color to get a better blend here. I tend to use same colors to color my different images to get a balance all over my card. Next, coloring this mushroom image from Gnome Me Stamp set from My Favorite Things. To color the bottom part of the mushroom, I'm using E33, E31 and E30 Copic marker. To color the top, I'm using some R markers. I'm using R89, R39 and R29 Copic markers here. This cute little snail is also from the same Gnome Me Stamp set. For his shell, I'm using E79, E77, E74 and E71 Copic marker. I started with E77 as my darkest marker, but when I colored the first layer, I felt that it wasn't dark enough, so I added E79 to the darkest parts to create that nice contrast. For his body, I'm using E33, E31, E30 Copic marker, and I also used R20 to add some blush to his cheeks. For the grass, I'm using G28, YG17 and YG03 Copic markers. This is my favorite and very frequently used green combo. My card has lots of flowers, so for one of them I'm using R24, R22 and R20 Copic markers. Next, I'm coloring this shoe image. It's again from the same Gnome Me Stamp set from My Favorite Things. I'm using E59 to add shadows to my shoes. Then I'll use E57 to blend those shadows and pull them a little inside. Lastly, I'll use E55 as my lightest marker and fill in the rest of the area and try to blend everything out. Here you can see that E57 and E55 did not blend as beautifully, but as I lay my second layer of color, these colors will blend a little more better and I'll get a good transition between all the colors. This is the reason I like to add 2 layers of color to my Copic colored images. To color the flowers and leaves on the shoes, I used the same colors that I used to color the other leaves and flowers on this card. All the colors I've used are listed on the bottom of the screen, and it is very simple coloring that I have done here. And the same way I'll color rest of my flowers off camera, not sharing all the coloring here since I colored quite a lot of flowers, but I just used 2 markers per flower, added darker color towards the center and then blended it out using my lighter marker. Next, I die cut these tree parts using Safari Trees die from My Favorite Things. I die cut these using Sour Apple cardstock from My Favorite Things. And now I'm inking these up using Lucky Clover Distress Oxide ink to add some depth to all these die cuts. Now let's assemble the card. I'm starting with my interactive element here. Using a circle punch, I'm cutting out a circle out of my card base. You can use circle dies to do this part, but a circle punch was easier to use here. Next, I have these 2 circle die cuts that I die cut using interactive swing die from My Favorite Things. And I'm gluing a circular disc on top of one of the circle die cuts using liquid glue. While that is drying, I'll go ahead and glue down the 3 die cuts directly on my card base around the circle that I punched earlier. The disc that I glued to the die cut circle is the spin and slide disc from My Favorite Things and is used quite a lot for interactive cards. But if you do not have this disc in hand, you can always use a foam square. Here I have glued all the 3 pieces and now I'm trimming off the excess that's hanging off the card. Here I'm placing my circle die cut with the disc from behind the card base, and then I'm placing this other die cut that I die cut from the same interactive swing die set. It goes into the disc very easily. Now I'm placing another circle die cut on top of the disc using liquid glue. Here I'm trimming off the excess of that die cut, which will be my interactive element, and my image will go and get glued on it to create that swinging motion. So here I'm just measuring where I want to trim that image to fit my card. This image is from the stamp set called Start Each Day with a V. It's a good size image and will be perfect for any card size. Here I'm adding liquid glue to the pendulum looking die cut that's already attached to our card base and gluing down the girl's image on top of it. Now to hide the top part of the interactive element, I'm gluing down the left out 3 die cuts using a combination of liquid glue and foam tape. Now I'll start gluing rest of the elements here. I wanted to make my scene look continuous when the card is folded. So here I am gluing the elements with the card folded so that I can create that continuous look of the scene. I'm using my circle punch as the weight to help keep the card shut while I'm gluing the pieces. I used a combination of liquid glue and foam tape to glue all the grasses. Once the grasses were glued all around, I started gluing the mushrooms. I really liked the pop of red that these mushrooms added to my scene. I was being careful to glue only towards the left side of the folded part so that the card can open and close properly. Here I'm gluing down the flowers. Using my scissors, I trimmed a few flowers to fit my scene properly. Once I was done gluing the front of the card, I opened my card and now I'll glue everything towards the inside of my card. But before that, trimming off any excess that's hanging off the card. I used only liquid glue to glue anything towards the inside of the card as I wanted my card to close flat. Here I'm gluing few grasses, mushroom and few flowers around the shoe. You can see that I colored a lot of images to create this scene, and while I was coloring these images, my 20-month-old daughter was near me and she insisted on coloring one of the flowers. So here is this one flower that she colored. She chose the purple crayon on her own and colored the petal parts of the flower. And I was so happy to see that she didn't scribble this whole die cut but instead colored the petal part very patiently. So I decided to include this flower in my card. So here gluing down that flower near the shoes, along with few more flowers that I colored in the same purple color. I'm almost done here, finishing up the scene near the gnome. Next, gluing down the snails that I colored earlier. They look so cute added to this scene. Next, I'm white heat embossing the sentiment onto a black cardstock. I have prepped the surface using anti-static powder tool and stamping the sentiment using clear ink. Next, pouring white embossing powder on top of it, and then I'll heat set it using my heat tool. Here I'm trimming off the sentiments to fit my card. I've used 2 sentiments here. The first says hello that goes on the front of my card, and the other says you are a friend like no other that goes towards the inside of my card. I tried stamping these sentiments directly to my card base but I messed up, so I decided to go ahead and heat emboss it on the black cardstock. Here I'm gluing a 8.5 by 3.5 white panel to the back of my card base to make it look more neat and tidy. Just remember not to add any glue near the interactive mechanism. My card is almost done here, but I wanted to add some embellishment to my card and I wasn't sure which one to add. So I went through my stash and found these leaf clay bits from my Etsy store, which matches perfectly with all the flowers and colors that I have added on this card and adds a nice colorful touch to that tree area without distracting from the scene. And even I'm creating a spring scene card, I added few leaves towards the bottom of my hill to show that few leaves have fallen from the tree onto the hill. I just love these clay bits on my card and I didn't know when to stop. But I think it came out all pretty good and I really liked how this card ended up. So this was my card for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I upload new videos every week. Here are a few more videos that you might like to watch. Thank you for visiting. Have a nice day.